She was worth $4 billion. She had nothing left but a stranger's mercy. On the worst night of her life, Serena Blackwood, CEO, cover story, untouchable, was bleeding in a ditch off a rural highway outside Chicago, and the people who put her there were still out there, waiting to confirm the job was done. The man who found her was a mechanic with grease under his fingernails, a 7-year-old daughter at home, and absolutely no reason to get involved in someone else's war. He got involved anyway. What happened next would cost them both everything, and give them something neither of them had ever expected to find again. If this story already has you, hit that like button right now, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The rain had been coming down hard since 6 in the evening, the kind of rain that turned Illinois highways into rivers of black glass and made sensible people pull off the road and wait it out in a gas station parking lot with a bad cup of coffee. Landon Pierce was not being sensible. He was being late. He had promised Emma he'd be home by 7:30. It was already 8:15, and his phone had died somewhere around the third hour of pulling apart a seized transmission on a '09 Ford pickup that belonged to a retired school teacher who couldn't afford to buy another vehicle. He'd stayed until the job was done because that was how he operated, because the woman had looked at him with eyes full of quiet worry, and because he'd thought about his own mother in moments like that. And because some things you just finished even when your back ached and the rain started and the fluorescent lights in the shop buzzed like they were dying. Mrs. Calloway, who watched Emma on the evenings Landon worked late, had a strict policy about anything past 9. She'd told him that twice. He was already in violation of the spirit of the agreement, if not yet the letter. He took the back route home. Route 41 cutting through the farmland west of Glen Brook. No traffic lights, no intersections for 4 miles at a stretch, just flat Illinois earth and the occasional grain silo rising out of the dark like something that had always been there and would always be there after everything else was gone. The rain hammered the roof of his truck. The wipers worked hard and still couldn't fully keep up. He had the radio turned low, an AM station out of Chicago playing something old and slow that he wasn't really listening to. He almost missed it. The skid marks were what caught his eye first. Long black streaks across the wet asphalt, curving hard toward the shoulder, disappearing into the tall grass at the road's edge. His headlights swept across the scene for just a second as he passed, long enough to catch the pale gleam of metal in the ditch. Landon pulled over. He sat there for a moment with the engine running, looking in his rear-view mirror at the darkness behind him. The practical part of his brain ran through the options quickly. Call 911, which he couldn't do because his phone was dead. Drive to the nearest house, which was probably the Hendersons' farm about a mile back, or get out in the rain and see what he was actually dealing with. He was already getting out of the truck. The vehicle in the ditch was a black SUV. A big one, current model year, the kind that cost more than he made in 3 years. It had gone nose first into the ditch at a steep angle, the front end buried in mud and dead grass, the back wheels still on the shoulder's edge. The driver's side airbag had deployed. He could see that through the window, the pale fabric sagging against the steering wheel. He pulled the door open. The woman inside was conscious, which was the first thing he registered, and then he registered everything else in rapid succession. The blood at her temple, dried and dark against pale skin, the way she was holding her right leg at an angle that suggested something was very wrong with it. The quality of her clothes, which, even soaked with rain and disheveled, were obviously expensive in the way that only things made from very good materials could be. And her face, which triggered some distant recognition he couldn't immediately place. The kind of recognition you get when you see someone you've seen before but can't remember where. "Hey," he said. "You're okay. I've got you." She looked at him. Her eyes were dark and sharp, even through the obvious pain, and the first thing she said to him wasn't "thank God" or "help me" or even "I'm hurt." She said, "Don't call the police." He stared at her for a second. "You're bleeding." "I know I'm bleeding." Her voice was tight and controlled, the kind of voice that was used to giving instructions and having them followed. "I'm telling you not to call the police. Can you do that?" "You need an ambulance." "I need you to listen to me." She shifted and then went very still, her jaw tightening against what must have been significant pain. "Please, I know how this sounds. I need you to trust me when I tell you that calling anyone official right now, police, ambulance, anyone who has to log the call, will make everything significantly worse. I just need... She stopped, breathed, started again. I need somewhere to go, somewhere they can't find me. Landon crouched in the wet grass beside the open door and looked at her carefully. She was maybe 30, maybe younger. The blood at her temple had come from a cut above her eyebrow, not deep enough to be dangerous on its own, but still bleeding sluggishly. Her right leg was the real problem. The way she was protecting it, the angle of her knee, suggested a serious ligament injury at minimum. She wasn't going anywhere under her own power. "Who's they?" he asked. Something moved behind her eyes. Not fear exactly, something more calculated than fear. "Right now," she said. "I think it would be better if you didn't know." He should have called 911 from the first gas station he passed. He knew that then, and he knew it later. But there was something in her face. Not the fear, not the calculation, but something underneath both of those things. Something raw and exhausted that had nothing to do with the accident, that made him think about a person who had run out of road and was looking at the edge of a cliff. He'd seen that look before. He'd seen it in a hospital room once, on a face that still visited him in dreams. "All right," he said. She blinked. "All right? My truck's back there. Can you move at all?" "If I have to." "Oh, you're going to have to lean on me. Don't put weight on that leg." Getting her out of the SUV and across the wet shoulder and into the passenger seat of his truck took almost 8 minutes and cost her more than she showed. She made one sound, a sharp, involuntary exhale when her bad leg caught the edge of the running board, and then nothing after that. She was someone who had learned, somewhere along the way, not to make noise when she was hurting. He turned the heat on full. She was shaking, though she was doing her best to hide that too. He pulled back onto Route 41, heading west, toward home, toward Emma, toward a situation he was not remotely prepared for. The rain was still coming down. "What's your name?" he asked. A pause. Then, "Serena." "Landon." He kept his eyes on the road. "You need to tell me something. Not everything, just enough." She was quiet for long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. When she spoke, her voice was careful, each word placed with precision. "I'm not running from the police," she said. "I haven't done anything wrong. The people looking for me have resources. If I show up in a hospital database or a 911 log, they'll find out within hours." Another pause. "I need maybe 2 or 3 days, somewhere quiet. Then I'll be out of your life and you'll never have to think about this again." "What happened to your car?" She looked out the passenger window at the black fields passing in the rain. "Someone happened to it," she said. Landon's farmhouse sat about a quarter-mile off Route 41, at the end of a gravel drive lined with old oaks that his wife had loved. The house itself was nothing remarkable, a white 2-story that needed paint on the south-facing side, a porch that sloped very slightly to the left, a barn out back that he used for storage and vehicle work. The lights in the living room were on. Mrs. Calloway's sedan was still in the drive. He helped Serena out of the truck and got her to the porch steps, her arm across his shoulders, his hand at her waist. She was lighter than he expected. The rain had softened to a drizzle. The front door opened before he could touch the handle. Mrs. Calloway stood there in her coat and her sensible shoes, ready to be irritated about the hour, and then her eyes moved from Landon to the woman leaning against him. And her expression did several things in quick succession. "Lord Almighty," she said, and then caught herself and said something more useful. "Let's get her inside." Emma appeared at the top of the stairs in her pajamas, the yellow ones with the small white stars that she'd picked out herself at Target 3 months ago and refused to acknowledge were getting too small. She was 7 years old, and she had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and she stood at the top of those stairs looking down at the bleeding woman her father had brought home with the absolute seriousness of a person twice her age. "Daddy," she said. "Hey, Bug." He was getting Serena to the couch. "Go back to bed." "She's hurt." "She's okay. Go on." Emma did not go back to bed. She came down the stairs instead, one careful step at a time, and stood in the living room doorway and watched with those serious eyes as her father and Mrs. Calloway got the stranger settled onto the couch. Mrs. Calloway was not a medical professional. She was, however, 71 years old and had raised 4 children on a farm, which meant she had some practical knowledge of injuries and considerably less tolerance for drama than a person might expect. She cleaned the cut at Serena's temple with the first aid kit from the kitchen cabinet. She assessed the leg with careful, impersonal hands. "Not broken," she said. "Probably the ACL. You'll need it looked at by someone who knows what they're doing, but not tonight." She sat back and looked at Serena with an expression that contained a great deal, but communicated very little. "You should eat something." Serena, who had been silent through most of this, looked up at the old woman. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. You can thank me when I know you're not going to bring trouble to this house." It wasn't an accusation, it was a statement of terms. Serena met her eyes and nodded once, and something passed between them, some kind of mutual sizing up, and Mrs. Calloway went to the kitchen to heat up the soup that was left from dinner. Emma had not moved from the doorway. Landon went to her and crouched down. "She's okay," he said. "She just needs to rest." Emma was looking past him at Serena. "Does she have somewhere to go?" "We're going to figure that out. She could stay here." "Emma, we have the guest room." She said it the way she said most things, with a kind of calm certainty that sometimes unnerved him, because he couldn't always tell if it was confidence or just a child's inability to see why things were complicated. "It's just sitting there." He looked at his daughter for a moment. Then he stood up and went back to the couch. Serena was watching Emma with an expression he couldn't fully read, something complicated moving behind those careful eyes. "You can have the guest room," he said. "It's not much, but you're welcome to it." She looked at him, then back at Emma. "I'll be gone in a few days," she said. It sounded like she was reminding herself as much as she was telling them. "Sure," he said. "Get some rest tonight." Her name came to him at 2 a.m. He was lying in his own bed staring at the ceiling the way he did on the nights when sleep stayed at a distance, and he was turning over the events of the evening with the systematic quality of a man who fixed things for a living, examining the pieces, looking for the logic, and the name came to him the way things come to you in the half-dark. Serena Blackwood. He'd seen the name on the cover of a business magazine at the shop, 6 months ago maybe, one of those glossy publications that clients sometimes left behind, the youngest female CEO in the Fortune 500 or something like that. He hadn't read the article. He'd used the magazine to prop up a car door while he worked on the hinges and thought nothing more of it. Serena Blackwood. Blackwood Technologies. He was trying to remember the number and couldn't, but it was large, very large. He lay there for another 20 minutes thinking about this, and then he got up, went to the kitchen, and opened his laptop. The news was full of her. Breaking. Billionaire CEO Serena Blackwood missing. Last seen Tuesday evening in Chicago. Blackwood Technologies shares plunge as CEO disappears. Foul play. Suspected in disappearance of tech mogul Serena Blackwood. He read 3 articles in full and skimmed 4 more. The official story was thin. She had left her Chicago penthouse on Tuesday evening and had not been seen since. Her personal security team had been stood down 2 days prior, at her own instruction apparently, which was being treated as suspicious. The Chicago PD had opened a missing persons investigation. The company's board of directors had released a statement expressing concern and pledging full cooperation. One article included a shareholder quote that made him read it twice. "Whatever has happened to Serena, the company has strong leadership in place to continue operations in her absence. We are fully confident in the board's ability to manage this transition." Transition. The word sat in that sentence like a stone. He closed the laptop and sat in the dark kitchen with his coffee going cold. He thought about the way she'd said someone happened to it when he'd asked about the car. He thought about the word transition. He went back to bed and lay there until the sky outside the window went from black to dark gray to the pale color of early morning. Then he got up and started coffee and waited. She was awake when Emma came downstairs at 7:15. He heard it from the kitchen, the small sound of his daughter's footsteps on the stairs, slower than usual, careful, and then the creak of the guest room door, which Emma had apparently knocked on very quietly. He stood in the kitchen doorway and watched. Emma was standing in the hall. The guest room door was slightly open. "Are you awake?" Emma asked. A pause. Then Serena's voice rough with sleep. "Yeah." "Do you want breakfast? Dad makes eggs." Another pause, longer this time. "I don't want to be any trouble," Serena said. Emma considered this. "You're already here," she said, with the unassailable logic of a 7-year-old. "So it's not extra trouble." He heard something that might have been a quiet laugh from behind the door. "Okay," Serena said. "Yeah, thank you." Emma came back to the kitchen with the expression of someone whose reasonable proposal had been accepted, and Landon started cracking eggs without comment. Serena emerged 10 minutes later, dressed in the clothes she'd arrived in, moving carefully with the bad leg, her hair pulled back and the cut at her temple covered with the bandage Mrs. Calloway had applied the night before. She looked like someone who had slept badly in strange surroundings and was doing her best not to show it. She looked, he noticed, considerably younger than the magazine covers had suggested, or maybe just different without the professional presentation, the context, the framing of wealth and authority stripped away by mud and circumstance. She sat at the kitchen table and drank the coffee he put in front of her without speaking. Emma sat across from her and ate her eggs and watched her with open curiosity. "Do you live in Chicago?" Emma asked. "Emma," Landon said. "It's fine." Serena looked at Emma. "I have an apartment there, and an office." "Do you like it?" Serena considered the question with more seriousness than it strictly required. "The office," she said, "I used to like. The apartment is efficient." Emma processed this. "What does that mean?" "It means it has everything I need, and I'm never there long enough to notice whether I like it or not." Emma nodded, as if this explained something meaningful. "Our house is old," she said, "and the porch is crooked, but Dad says it's home because of who's in it, not what it looks like." Serena looked at Landon over the rim of her coffee cup. He was suddenly very focused on the eggs. He told her what he'd found online that morning after Emma had gone to school. He walked her to the end of the drive and watched the bus take her, the way he did every morning, regardless of weather. And then he came back inside and sat down at the kitchen table across from Serena and put his phone between them, the news articles pulled up on the screen. She didn't react much. She read the headlines, scrolled through one article, and then pushed the phone back across the table. "How bad is it?" he asked. "It's being managed," she said, in the tone of someone who was not sure that was true. "Someone tampered with your car." She looked at him. He looked back. Outside, the morning was gray and the fields were wet from last night's rain, and somewhere in the barn a board was loose and tapping in the wind the way it had been tapping for 3 months despite him intending to fix it. "Yes," she said. "The same people who—" He gestured at the phone. "The board? That quote about transition?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You read carefully." "I fix engines. I have to read carefully." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. She told him some of it then. Not all of it. He understood that there were pieces she was still holding close, either because she didn't trust him fully yet, or because laying it out in full made it more real than she could manage on no sleep and a bad leg in a stranger's kitchen. But enough. Her father had built Blackwood Technologies from a small data security firm into something worth several $1 billion over 20 years. He had died 2 years ago, suddenly, a heart attack at 63, and had left the company to Serena with the stipulation that she remain CEO for a minimum of 5 years before the board could propose any structural changes. He had not fully trusted his own board, which Serena had known and not known what to do with at the time. In the 18 months since she'd taken full control, she had understood why. 3 members of the executive board, she named them, Gerald Fitch, Marcus Hale, and a woman named Donna Price, who had been her father's closest advisor and who Serena had trusted more than anyone else in the company, had been quietly building a relationship with an outside investor named Roland Cross. Cross ran a private equity firm that had a reputation for acquiring technology companies and then stripping them for parts, selling off the profitable divisions, gutting the workforce, rebranding the remainder as something smaller and more agile, a word that in Landon's experience tended to mean fewer people doing more work for less money. The plan, as best Serena had been able to piece together over the past 4 months, was straightforward in its ugliness. manufacture a crisis in the company's leadership, use that crisis to call an emergency board vote, and remove Serena as CEO on grounds of instability or conflict of interest or whatever language their lawyers had settled on. With Serena gone, Roland Cross's investment would convert to a controlling stake, and the dismantling could begin. She had been building her own case against them. 4 months of quietly gathering documents, pulling financial records, tracing the paper trail that connected Fitch and Hale and Donna Price to Cross's money. She'd been 3 weeks away from having enough to take to federal regulators. Then, 4 days ago, she'd received an anonymous message containing photographs. Photographs of herself, taken outside her office building, outside her apartment, outside a restaurant where she'd met her lawyer. She'd been under surveillance for at least 2 months without knowing it. The same day, she'd received a call from someone whose voice she didn't recognize, who had told her very quietly that the photographs were a courtesy, that she should understand the situation and consider her options. He'd used the phrase, "consider your options," twice. She'd understood exactly what that meant. She'd dismissed her security team before they could be compromised or used against her. She'd taken her personal vehicle, not the company car, and driven. She hadn't had a plan. She'd had a direction. West, away from Chicago, toward a contact she trusted in Rockford who might be able to help her move the evidence she'd gathered into the right hands without going through channels that had been compromised. She never made it to Rockford. The brake failure had happened 40 minutes outside the city. She'd managed to slow the vehicle enough by dragging against the guardrail on a long bend, but the final loss of control had been total, and she'd gone into the ditch at what the physics suggested was still close to 40 miles an hour. She finished talking. The kitchen was quiet except for the loose board in the barn. Landon sat with all of this for a long moment. "The evidence you gathered?" he said. "Where is it?" She reached inside her jacket. She'd kept the jacket on through breakfast despite the house being warm, and produced a small external hard drive, silver, no bigger than a deck of cards. She set it on the table between them. "Everything's on here," she said. 4 months of work, financial records, email chains, wire transfers, contracts. She paused. "And the photographs they sent me, which I copied before I left. What do you need to do with it?" "I need to get it to someone I trust at the SEC or to a federal prosecutor's office, someone who isn't in contact with anyone at Blackwood and who won't tip off Cross's people before they have the full picture." She looked at the drive. "The problem is every person I could normally go to knows where to find me and what I look like. Right now, while everyone thinks I might be dead, while they're not watching for me to make a move, is the only window I have." "How long is that window?" "Days, maybe less." She looked up. "If Cross's people realize the brake tampering didn't work and that I'm out there somewhere with the evidence, they'll move faster. They may already be moving." He looked at her. Then he looked at the hard drive. "You said 3 days," he said. "If we're lucky." He nodded slowly. "All right." He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, and put it back down. "All right." The rest of that first day was quiet, in the way that weather builds quietly before something breaks. Serena spent most of it at the kitchen table with her laptop, which she'd had in a bag in the crashed SUV and which had survived the accident largely unharmed. She worked with the focused, contained energy of someone accustomed to operating under pressure, and she asked him for the Wi-Fi password and didn't abuse the courtesy by asking for anything else. He stayed out of her way and did the things that needed doing, called the shop and told them he'd be out another day, brought in firewood, made lunch, fixed the loose board in the barn finally, the way he should have 3 months ago. When Emma came home from school, she dropped her backpack at the door and went directly to the kitchen. "How's your leg?" she asked Serena. "Better," Serena said, which was not entirely true but was better than yesterday. "I looked you up," Emma said. Landon, coming in from the barn, stopped in the kitchen doorway. Serena looked up from her laptop. "Did you?" "On the school computers at lunch. You're on the news." Emma put her backpack down and took her usual chair with her usual directness. "They said you're missing." "I'm not missing," Serena said carefully. "I know exactly where I am." Emma thought about this. "Are you hiding?" "Emma," Landon started. "A little," Serena said. Emma nodded, taking this in with the same serious composure she applied to most information. "Is it because of the bad people?" A pause. What bad people? The ones who made your car crash. Emma said it with the matter-of-fact certainty of a child who has already connected the relevant dots and is waiting for the adults to catch up. That's why you didn't want Dad to call the police, because if the bad people find out where you are, that's worse. Serena looked at Emma for a long moment. Yeah, she said quietly. Something like that. Okay. Emma unzipped her backpack. I won't tell anyone. Dinner that night was different from breakfast. Something about the rhythm of the day, the ordinary domestic sequence of it, school and work, and the smell of something cooking, had shifted the atmosphere in the house, settled it slightly. Landon made pasta and a sauce from canned tomatoes and whatever vegetables were in the refrigerator, and they ate at the kitchen table. The three of them, and Emma talked about her day at school with the unselfconscious detail of a child who assumes that everyone around her is interested in the same thing she is. She was not wrong, in this case. Serena listened with the quality of attention that Emma was not used to receiving from adults, and it showed in the way Emma's stories gradually expanded, grew bolder, took on more detail and color. Landon watched this from across the table and ate his pasta and tried not to think about what it meant that his daughter was attaching herself to a woman who had promised to be gone in 2 days. After dinner, Emma negotiated an extension of her bedtime, successfully, as she usually did, by the simple tactic of producing a book and sitting between Landon and Serena on the couch, and beginning to read aloud, which made the question of going to bed feel somewhat beside the point. The book was a chapter book about a girl who could talk to animals, which Emma was in the middle of and had apparently decided required an immediate audience update. She read with expression and appropriate voices, and she paused after each significant plot development to gauge their reactions. She's something, Serena said quietly when Emma had gone to refill her water glass. Yeah, Landon said. She's smart. I mean, really smart. Her mother was a teacher, he said, 3rd grade. She had a way of being interested in things that Emma picked up. He hadn't planned to say that. It came out of some older habit, the way it sometimes did, referencing Claire in the present tense and then catching it halfway through, adjusting. Serena didn't press. She was learning the shape of certain silences. How long has it been? She asked. 3 years. He looked at the fire, which was low and needed attending. Emma was 4. She doesn't remember much, which is... He stopped, reached for something honest. I can't decide if that's better or worse. Most days, I think both. Serena was quiet for a moment. My father has been dead for 2 years, she said, and I still reach for the phone to call him sometimes. I'll think he would find this funny, and then I remember. She paused. I don't think it stops. The reaching. He looked at her. She was looking at the fire. Emma came back with her water and climbed between them and found her page. The call came at 11:15 that night. He was almost asleep when he heard it. Not his phone, which was on the nightstand and silent, but a sound from downstairs, quickly muffled. He lay still for a moment and then got up. The guest room light was on under the door. He knocked. Yeah. Her voice was different, tight. He opened the door. She was sitting on the edge of the bed with her phone in her hand, and her face had the expression of someone who had just heard something they were hoping not to hear. What happened? She looked up. I have a contact at Blackwood, someone I trust. She just sent me a message. Serena held up the phone. They know I'm alive. Cross's people say they pulled traffic camera footage from the highway near the crash site. They found a truck on camera stopping and turning around near the accident location. He took this in. They can track the truck? The plates are visible. They're running them now. She looked at him directly. They'll have this address within hours. The house was quiet. Outside, the wind had come up again. Okay, he said. Landon. Her voice did something complicated on his name. This isn't your problem. You found me on the road. You've been... She stopped. I need you to understand that what I'm about to ask you to do is dangerous, and that you have a daughter, and that you should say no. He stood in the doorway of the guest room for a moment. What are you about to ask me? She looked at the hard drive on the nightstand. I need to get to Chicago, she said. and I can't do it alone. He looked at the drive, then at her, then back at the drive, with the patience of a man examining an engine problem he hadn't encountered before but was fairly certain he could work out. "All right," he said. "Let me think." It was the same thing he'd said on the highway when she'd asked him not to call the police. The same word. She recognized it this time for what it was. Not agreement exactly, but the sound of a person deciding to stay in the room. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't known, until that moment, how much she'd needed it. Outside, the wind was moving through the oaks along the drive, the same trees that had been standing there since before either of them were born, bending in the storm and not breaking, doing what trees that have stood long enough eventually learn to do. He went to make coffee. They had planning to do. The coffee was bad because he'd made it too strong and hadn't noticed until he was already drinking it. And somehow, that was the most normal thing about the next 3 hours. They sat at the kitchen table with the hard drive between them and a legal pad he'd found in the junk drawer, and Serena walked him through it, the structure of it, the scope of it, the particular ugliness of people who had been trusted and had made a deliberate choice to betray that trust anyway. She was a different person when she talked about the business. Not colder exactly, but more precise, the way certain tools feel different in your hand when they're being used for what they were designed for. She'd spent 4 months building this case in the margins of running a billion-dollar company, which was not the kind of thing a person did casually. She'd pulled financial statements and cross-referenced them against wire transfers. She'd traced shell companies through 3 jurisdictions. She'd saved emails that she wasn't supposed to have seen, forwarded from an address belonging to an assistant who had eventually come to her quietly and said she thought something was wrong. Her name was Patricia, the assistant. Serena mentioned her only once, briefly, and moved on, but Landon filed it away. There was at least one person inside the company who was still on her side. Roland Cross had been wiring money into accounts connected to Gerald Fitch and Marcus Hale for 14 months. The amounts were structured carefully, under reporting thresholds routed through enough intermediaries to be non-obvious. But the pattern was clear once you knew to look for it. Donna Price's involvement was cleaner and therefore harder to prove, which was the part of the case Serena had still been building when the photographs arrived. "How did Donna Price stay cleaner?" Landon asked. "She's smarter than the other two." Serena said it without heat, which told him more than anger would have. Fitch and Hale are greedy in the obvious way. They leave tracks because they're not really thinking about what they're doing to get caught. They're thinking about what they're getting. Donna thinks about everything. She paused. "She was my father's most trusted advisor for 18 years. I used to call her Aunt Donna." He looked at her. "Not anymore," she said. They worked until almost 2 in the morning, mapping out what they had and what they needed and who, specifically, Serena trusted enough to hand it to. She had a name, a federal prosecutor in the Chicago district named Warren Kessler, who had graduated the same year as Serena's father from Northwestern Law, and who had been, as best Serena could determine, outside the orbit of anyone connected to Cross or the board. She'd found him through 3 degrees of separation and a conversation with her own corporate attorney that she'd kept deliberately oblique. The problem was access. Walking into a federal prosecutor's office with a hard drive and a story about corporate conspiracy while the news was reporting you as a missing person was not a simple transaction. She needed someone to make contact first, someone who could reach Kessler through a channel that wouldn't be immediately visible to Cross's people. "Patricia," Landon said. Serena looked up. "Your assistant. You mentioned her like you still trust her." Something moved in Serena's face. "She's the one who sent me the message tonight, about the traffic camera footage. Can she reach Kessler's office without anyone at Blackwood knowing?" Serena thought about this. If she uses her personal phone, personal email, she chewed on the inside of her cheek, an unguarded habit that she probably wasn't aware of. She'd be taking a risk. Bigger risk than staying and saying nothing? A long pause. "No," she said. "Not bigger than that." They settled on a plan that was less a plan and more a sequence of necessary improvisations. Patricia would contact Kessler's office and request a private meeting on behalf of an anonymous source with evidence relevant to a federal securities investigation. Serena would confirm through a secure message that the source was credible. They would have, at best, a 12-hour window between the time Cross's people identified the truck plates and the time they could mobilize to act on the address. 12 hours. Maybe less. Landon wrote the timeline on the legal pad with the kind of methodical handwriting he used for work orders. Serena watched him write and didn't say anything for a moment. "You're not scared," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm a little scared," he said without looking up. "I'm also tired. Those are different problems. Most people would have called the police the moment I asked them not to." He set down the pen. "Most people also don't read the word transition in a public statement and understand exactly what it means." He looked at her. "I grew up watching my father get managed out of a job he'd had for 20 years by people who were very good at making it sound like it was his idea. I know what it looks like when someone's taking what isn't theirs and calling it something reasonable." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm sorry about your father," she said. "He's fine. He retired to Florida. He's annoying about it." He picked up the pen again. "But I know what I saw." She almost smiled. It was the second time that night she'd come close. They agreed on a watch rotation, 4 hours each, and she went back to the guest room, and he went to his own bed, and he was asleep in under 5 minutes, which was how he'd always operated. Decide what you can do it when it's time, and don't borrow trouble from hours that haven't arrived yet. Claire had called it his best quality and his most maddening one, usually in the same sentence. He woke at 6 to the sound of Emma's alarm through the ceiling. The morning moved with its usual stubbornness. Emma needed breakfast and her homework folder and the particular hair tie that was not the blue one or the yellow one, but the other blue one, which turned out to be under the bathroom sink for reasons neither of them could reconstruct. Serena appeared in the kitchen doorway at 6:40, moving better on the leg than she had the day before, and poured her own coffee this time without asking, which he noted without comment. He walked Emma to the end of the drive. The bus came in its reliable way, and Emma got on, and he stood there until it had turned the corner and disappeared, the way he always did. The fields on either side of the road were pale with morning frost. His breath made clouds. When he turned back toward the house, Serena was standing on the porch with her coffee, watching him. "She's going to be okay today," Serena said. "She doesn't know anything is happening." "She suspects something," he said. "She's 7, not oblivious. She didn't ask any questions at breakfast. That's actually when I worry more." He went up the porch steps. Emma not asking questions means she's decided not to, which means she's already figured out enough to know the answer might be something she doesn't want to hear. Serena considered this. "She sounds exhausting." "She's the best thing that ever happened to me." He said it plainly, no decoration. "So yeah, exhausting." Serena looked away toward the frost-white fields. There was something in her face he'd been noticing since last night, a quality of careful stillness, the kind a person develops when they've learned to manage what they let show. She was good at it, but it slipped sometimes in the small moments, in the space between sentences. Patricia had sent a confirmation message at 5:40 that morning. She'd reached out to Warren Kessler's office the night before. An assistant had called back. A meeting had been arranged for the following day, provisionally, pending confirmation of the source and the nature of the evidence. Kessler was out of the city until tomorrow morning, 24 hours. They had to hold another 24 hours. He went inside and called the shop and told them he needed one more day. His boss, a tolerant man named Gil, who had known Landon for 11 years, said sure in the tone of someone who was not sure at all but understood the difference between a man who needed a day and a man who was taking advantage, and knew which one he was dealing with. When he came back to the kitchen, Serena was on the phone, speaking in a voice so controlled it was almost colorless. The business voice, whatever feeling it might have had drained out of it by practice. She wrapped the call quickly when she heard him and put the phone face down on the table. "Patricia," she said, "there's a board meeting scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. An emergency session," Fitch called it. "What's the agenda?" "The formal agenda is ongoing leadership uncertainty due to CEO Ebsen." She said it with her mouth in a thin line. "The actual agenda is starting the process to remove me permanently." "Can they do that in one meeting?" "Not finalize it, but they can put the mechanism in motion, and once that starts..." She stopped. "Once it's in motion, even if I walk back in tomorrow, They'll argue the company can't have someone with questions about their stability or reliability in the CEO role. They'll make it about protecting shareholders. Roland Cross will be there as a technical observer. He'll provide the votes they need. What do you need to stop it? I need to be in that room. She said it like she'd been thinking about it for a while. I need to walk into that meeting with the evidence in hand and something else, something I've been sitting on that I haven't told you yet. He waited. She reached into her laptop bag and produced a folder. Physical paper, printed documents, which given everything else seemed almost anachronistic. She laid it open on the table. My father had a very specific attorney, she said, a woman named Dr. Helen Marsh, who drafted his will and the succession documents for the company. Before he died, about 6 months before, which means he knew something was wrong even then, he had her draw up a secondary document, a voting rights trust. She tapped the papers. Under the terms of this document, in the event that I am named in a removal proceeding or vote of no confidence while serving as CEO, the voting rights of my shares, which are significant, transfer automatically to a protected trust that cannot be touched by the board or any outside investor. The trust can only be dissolved by me, in person, or by a court order. Landon looked at the documents. He was not a lawyer and had no pretense of being one, but he could read the substance of most things, and what he read here was the shape of a careful man who had seen what was coming and had built a wall around his daughter before she knew she needed one. Your father did this. 6 months before he died. Her voice was even. He told me about the trust, but not about its specific provisions. I found the full documentation 2 months after his death in a safety deposit box he'd left me access to. She paused. I think he knew exactly what Fitch and Hale were planning. I think he was protecting me before he was gone. The kitchen was very quiet. Why didn't you use this before? Landon asked. Before it got this far? Because it only activates in the context of a formal removal proceeding. It can't just be invoked. It requires the proceeding to be underway before the protections kick in. She looked at the documents. They have to actually start the process of removing me for the trust to take effect, which means I have to let them start it. And if you're not in the room when they start it, then they can argue the trust provision requires my physical presence to confirm, and they'll have enough procedural cover to delay it while Cross's people do something about it through other channels. He sat back. He thought about this the way he thought about complicated mechanical problems, following the path of each piece, finding where the pressure was, looking for what could hold and what would give. So you need to be in that room, he said. I need to walk into that boardroom tomorrow afternoon, she said, with Kessler's office already in possession of the evidence and ready to move, so that when I play the trust document, there's nothing they can do about it without making their exposure significantly worse. And if something goes wrong before Kessler, then I've got nothing except a hard drive and a voting rights document that I can't use without the meeting, and they win. She said it flatly. No self-pity in it, just the hard edge of a real possibility. I know how this sounds. I know I'm asking you to... You're not asking me anything yet, he said. You're just telling me the situation. She looked at him across the table. The situation is that I need to get to Chicago tomorrow morning, she said, early enough to meet with Kessler personally before the board meeting, and I need to do it without being identified before I'm in that building. Can you get into the building without them knowing? I have access the board can't revoke. It's biometric, fingerprint and retinal scan, installed on my direct authorization 2 years ago. Only the full board with a 3/4 majority vote can revoke it, and they haven't done that yet because legally they can't until a formal removal vote is completed. She paused. I walked out of that building on my own 2 days ago. I can walk back in. He nodded slowly. He thought about Emma. He thought about the bus arriving home at 3:15 and Mrs. Calloway's flexible willingness to stay through the afternoon. He thought about a truck on a traffic camera and people who made brakes fail on rainy highways. We'll need another vehicle, he said. Mine's been seen. I know someone in Rockford who can help with that. I mentioned him before. The contact you were driving to. Yes, he's a former colleague. I trust him. Enough to trust him with your location? She hesitated. The hesitation was honest. He could see her weighing it in real time, which he respected more than false certainty would have been. Yes, she said, but only him. No one else in that conversation. He nodded. All right, make the call. She did. The contact in Rockford, his name was Ben, and from the half of the conversation Landon could hear, he was someone who asked very few questions and had a talent for treating unusual requests as normal ones. Confirmed he could have a vehicle available by tomorrow morning. He would leave it at a location outside the city limits, keys under the passenger seat, nothing registered to anyone Serena knew. When she hung up, they sat with the new shape of the plan. You should sleep this afternoon, Landon said. We'll need to leave by 5 tomorrow morning. I don't sleep well in unfamiliar places. You slept last night. Barely. Barely is something. He picked up the legal pad and started making adjustments to the timeline. Eat lunch. Rest, even if you don't sleep. Your leg isn't going to hold up through a full day in Chicago on no rest. She opened her mouth and closed it again. What? He said. You're very direct, she said. It wasn't a complaint. It was more like an observation from someone who wasn't used to it and was still determining how they felt. I'm practical, he said. It's the same thing mostly. She was quiet for a moment. Landon? She said his name with that same complicated weight he'd noticed last night. If something goes sideways tomorrow, if crosses people. Emma is with Mrs. Calloway until 3:15, he said. If we're not back by noon, I call Mrs. Calloway and she keeps Emma through the afternoon. If we're not back by evening, I've already written a number down. He held up the legal pad. It's a friend of mine who was a police officer for 12 years and who I would trust with anything. He knows nothing about this situation, but he will know what to do if he hears from me. She looked at the legal pad. When did you do that? She asked. This morning, while you were on the phone. Another long pause. You plan like an engineer, she said. I fix things for a living, he said. Same principle. Figure out what can go wrong before it does. She looked at the hard drive on the table, at the folder of documents, at the legal pad in his hand with its careful, methodical handwriting. My father would have liked you, she said. The words came out quieter than she probably intended. He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything, which turned out to be the right call. The afternoon passed with a specific kind of tension that was not quite fear. More like the stillness before a large piece of equipment starts moving, when everything is ready and you're just waiting for the sequence to begin. He made soup from the last of the vegetables and some stock he found in the back of the refrigerator. Serena worked at the kitchen table with the contained focus he was starting to recognize as her default mode, pausing only to look out the window periodically at the gravel drive with the vigilance of someone who knew they were being looked for. He was in the barn doing an oil change on a neighbor's truck, a simple job he'd offered to do 2 weeks ago and kept putting off, when he heard Emma's bus. He wiped his hands and went to the end of the drive. Emma got off with her backpack listing sideways the way it always did when she'd overpacked her lunch bag, and she walked beside him toward the house with the specific chattiness of a child who'd had a full day and needed to unload it. She talked about her friend Maya, who had gotten a new dog and brought photographs, and about a math problem that she'd figured out a different way than the teacher showed them and whether that was okay or wrong, and about a book the class was reading that she found boring, and did that mean she wasn't smart because everyone else seemed to like it. Different things bore different people, he said. Doesn't mean anything about smart. Serena would probably think it's boring too, Emma said. He glanced down at her. What makes you say that? Because it's the kind of book that's for kids who don't read much, Emma said, with the merciless clarity of a child who reads constantly. And she seems like someone who reads a lot. He couldn't argue with that. Inside, Emma dropped her backpack and went to the kitchen and pulled out her homework folder, which she set on the far end of the table from Serena's laptop, with the careful spatial logic of someone who understood that the table had 2 functions this afternoon. Serena looked up, looked at the homework folder, and looked back at her screen without comment. They coexisted in the kitchen for 20 minutes in a surprisingly comfortable silence, Emma working through her math worksheet with the focused seriousness she brought to things she actually cared about, Serena reviewing documents on her laptop. Landon made hot chocolate and put it at Emma's elbow without interruption. It was Emma who broke the quiet. Can I ask you something? She said, addressing Serena without looking up from her worksheet. Sure, Serena said. Is what you do scary? Serena looked up. What do you mean? Running a company, making decisions for lots of people. Does it scare you? Emma flipped to the next page of the worksheet. My teacher says decisions are scary when they matter. Serena thought about this honestly, and Landon was watching her face when she did, and he could see the gears of something genuine moving underneath. Yeah, Serena said. It is, most of the time. Does it get easier? Honestly, no. You just get better at not showing it. Emma considered this. That seems like it would be tiring. It is, Serena said. It really, really is. Emma nodded and returned to her worksheet. I think that's why people need homes, she said, in the way she said things that came from some interior logic she'd developed quietly and entirely on her own. So they have somewhere to stop pretending. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Serena was very still. There was something happening in her face that she was not entirely successfully managing. Landon picked up his coffee cup and examined it with great interest. That's a pretty wise thing to say, Serena said finally. My dad says things like that sometimes, Emma said. I just try to remember them. He heard it at 11:40 that night. He'd been lying awake already. Not anxious exactly, but that specific alert quality that sometimes took him before something. The body knowing before the mind what the morning was going to ask of it. The sound was low and cautious, tires on gravel, moving slowly. No headlights visible through the window. He was out of bed before the sound completed itself, pulling on jeans and moving down the hall to Emma's room first. He stood in her doorway for 3 seconds, watching her sleep in the yellow star pajamas, and then went downstairs and into the kitchen without turning any lights on. Serena was already in the kitchen. She'd heard it too. She was by the window, back flat to the wall, looking at the narrow angle of the drive she could see without being visible herself. Landon came up beside her. One vehicle, dark color, stopped at the edge of the property near where the gravel met the road. Not at the house, but close enough to be watching it. The engine was off. There were 2 figures visible in the front seat. Yours? He asked. No. Her voice was steady, but her jaw was tight. Cross's people use 2-person teams, always. They stood there together, not moving, watching the car. The car didn't move either. They're confirming the address, Serena said quietly. They're not coming in tonight. If they were, they'd have moved already. They're watching. They'll report back, and then someone else will decide the next step. How much time does that give us? If we leave before 4 in the morning, we're ahead of whatever they put together. She paused. But they know we're here now. They'll be back. He thought about Emma sleeping upstairs. He thought about the bus that came at 7:15. We go at 3, he said. I'll call Mrs. Calloway at 6. She'll come for Emma before the bus. She'll have questions. I'll leave a note for Emma. She'll understand that I had to go and that I'll be back. He said it with a certainty he mostly felt. She trusts me. Serena was quiet for a moment. I won't let anything happen to her, she said. Or to you, if it comes to that. He looked at her in the dark kitchen. I know, he said, and he meant it, which surprised him slightly. They watched the car at the end of the drive for another 10 minutes. Then it backed out onto the road, and its taillights disappeared into the dark, heading back toward the highway. He made coffee. Neither of them went back to bed. The clock on the microwave read 11:58 when he sat down across from her at the table, and they both looked at the hard drive sitting between the coffee cups, small and silver, and carrying the whole weight of what came next. Tell me about your father, she said. Not the company, not the plan. His father. He looked at her. She looked back. Outside, the wind moved through the old oaks, and the house settled around them the way houses do when they've been standing long enough to know that the people inside them are worth holding, he told her. They left at 3:12 in the morning. Landon had written the note to Emma the night before, sitting at the kitchen table while Serena dozed in the chair across from him. Genuinely dozed, not slept, her head tilting forward every few minutes and then catching itself. He'd written the note twice. The first version was too long and explained too much, which was the kind of thing that worried a child rather than reassured one. The second version was 4 sentences. I had to go take care of something important. Mrs. Calloway is coming at 6:30. I'll be home before dinner. I love you more than everything. He left it folded on the kitchen table with her name on it in letters big enough to see from across the room. He'd texted Mrs. Calloway at midnight, which he felt bad about, and she had responded 9 minutes later with okay and nothing else, which was either the response of a woman who slept lightly and checked her phone, or the response of a woman who had been awake worrying about the situation in the farmhouse and had been waiting for him to say something. He suspected the latter. Mrs. Calloway had seen the dark car idling at the end of the drive the previous evening. She'd mentioned it when she dropped Emma off, her voice neutral in the particular way of someone asking a question without phrasing it as one. He hadn't answered the implied question, and she hadn't pushed, and now here they were. The vehicle Ben had arranged was a gray Ford sedan, 7 years old, nondescript in every dimension, parked at a truck stop 20 minutes outside Rockford with the keys exactly where he'd said they'd be. They left Landon's truck at the truck stop, concealed, roughly, between two semi-trailers, and Serena transferred her bag and the hard drive and the folder of documents to the Ford with the careful movements of someone whose right leg was still giving her grief even if she'd stopped acknowledging it. The drive to Chicago in the dark was quiet in the way that long drives before dawn can be. Not uncomfortable, just stripped of the social pressure that daylight hours carry. The highway was mostly empty. The heater worked. Serena had her laptop open on her knees, reviewing documents she'd already reviewed twice, and Landon drove and drank the coffee they'd brought in a thermos and watched the highway unroll in the headlights. At some point around 4:30, somewhere between the flat farmland thinning toward the suburbs, she stopped reading and just looked out at the dark passing outside the window. "What did your wife look like?" she asked. He wasn't startled by the question. They'd talked through most of the night, and conversations that run deep enough tend to find their own level eventually. "Tall," he said, "brown hair. She had a laugh that was loud. She was embarrassed about it, but it was one of my favorite things." He drove for a moment. "She looked like Emma, actually, around the eyes, the same color, the same thing they do when they're skeptical, this slight narrowing. I see it in Emma all the time, and I never know what to do with that, if it makes me happy or sad or both." "Both, probably," Serena said. "Both," he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. "What was her name?" "Claire." She said the name back to him softly, just once, and let it settle. He appreciated that. Some people, when you told them a dead person's name, treated it like a fragile object that had to be immediately surrounded by condolences. She just let the name be a name. Let Claire be a person who had existed and who had mattered without making it into a moment that required managing. "Your father really would have liked you," she said again, and this time she laughed slightly at herself for saying it twice, and the laugh was unexpected and genuine enough that he smiled at the road. They reached the outer edge of Chicago as the sky was going from dark to the pale, flat gray of early morning in a city. Serena directed him through a sequence of side streets to a parking garage 3 blocks from the federal building where Kessler's office was located. She'd arranged the meeting through Patricia, who had spoken with Kessler's assistant the evening before, and the time was 7:15, early, which was Serena's doing, because she'd wanted the meeting completed before news of it could reach anyone at Blackwood. The parking garage was cold and smelled of exhaust and damp concrete. She opened the car door and then stopped. "I need to tell you something," she said. He turned off the engine. "About Roland Cross." She was looking at her hands, the folder balanced on her knees. "He's not a stranger to me. When I first took over the company, the first 6 months when I was still finding my feet, he approached me with an investment proposal. It was a generous proposal, very well structured. I almost took it." She paused. "I spent 3 months in conversations with him before my father's attorney sent me something she'd found in my father's papers. A note my father had written about Cross. Not formal, just a handwritten note in a folder of personal papers. It said, 'Cross moves money the way certain people move through crowds. Quietly. And always toward the exit.' Landon considered this. I declined the investment," Serena continued. "Cross was professional about it. Thanked me for my time, wished the company well. 18 months later, I'm finding his money in Gerald Fitch's accounts." She finally looked up. "I'm telling you because when we walk into that building today, if something is different from what we planned, if Cross has moved faster than I expected, you need to understand who we're dealing with. He doesn't panic. He adjusts." She met Landon's eyes directly. "So we have to be more ready to adjust than he is." "Understood," he said. She nodded. She opened the car door. He came around and she took his arm. The leg genuinely needed it on the incline of the parking structure, and they had moved past the point of either of them pretending otherwise, and they walked out into the gray Chicago morning like two people who had a reasonable explanation for being there at 7 in the morning, which they did, though it was not an explanation that would have struck most people as reasonable. Chad. Warren Kessler was a compact man in his late 50s, with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent long careers listening carefully in rooms where everything said was important and most of it was a lie. He had a firm on the 11th floor of the federal building, and his assistant, a young woman named Angela, who had clearly been briefed on the unusual nature of this meeting, showed them in without comment and closed the door behind her. Kessler looked at Serena the way you look at something you've been briefed about and are now calibrating against the reality. He looked at Landon the way you look at something you have not been briefed about and are rapidly recalibrating around. "Miss Blackwood," he said. "Thank you for meeting us," she said. "You'll understand that I have some questions." "I'd be concerned if you didn't." He looked at Landon. "Landon Pierce," Landon said. "I'm the one who drove her here." Kessler looked at them both for another second and then sat down and folded his hands on the desk and said, "Start from the beginning. Leave nothing out." She didn't leave anything out. She was in the room with a federal prosecutor she'd spent 4 months identifying as trustworthy, and she had one shot at this, and she gave him everything: the timeline, the financial records, the wire transfers, the shell companies, the photographs, the tampered brakes, the emergency board meeting scheduled for that afternoon. She put the hard drive on his desk and the folder of documents beside it, and she talked for 41 minutes without notes, because she didn't need notes. She'd been carrying this in her head for 4 months. Kessler asked questions, good questions, the kind that found the seams in an account and pressed on them to check for give. She answered every one. Some of them she answered by pulling up documents on the laptop she'd brought, which she then turned and showed him rather than summarizing. When she finished, Kessler sat back and looked at the hard drive. "You understand that you came very close to not being here to hand me this," he said. "I understand that," she said. "You also understand that the appropriate response to what you were facing would have been to engage law enforcement immediately, rather than—" He gestured vaguely, which appeared to encompass Landon and the gravel drive and the gray Ford and the entire 3-day sequence of events. "With respect," Serena said, "I had credible evidence that my communications had been monitored for months. I had no way of knowing which channels were secure. I made a judgment call." Kessler looked at Landon again. "And this gentleman was the judgment call." "He was in the right place," she said, "and he made a choice." Kessler studied Landon in the quiet, non-hostile way of someone who has interviewed thousands of people and can read most of them in a short amount of time. Landon sat with this comfortably. He wasn't hiding anything. "All right," Kessler said finally. He picked up the hard drive. "I'm going to need several hours with this. My team will begin an assessment immediately. In the meantime," he looked at Serena, "you said the board meeting is at 2 this afternoon. 2 o'clock, Blackwood Tower, 42nd floor. You intend to attend." "I intend to walk into that room at 2 o'clock with the voting rights trust document in hand." "And if Cross has taken steps to neutralize your access between now and then?" "He can't. Not without a completed board vote, which hasn't happened." She said it steadily. "The only way he neutralizes me is by being in that room first and pushing the vote through before I arrive, which is why I need to arrive first." Kessler was quiet for a moment. "I can have 2 agents at that building by 1:30, he said, "observing. If what's on this drive is what you say it is, we'll be ready to move by the time the meeting concludes." He paused. "I'm going to want you reachable this morning." "I'll have my phone on." He looked at her one more time, the particular look of a man running a final check on his own judgment. "Your father was a careful person," he said. "You knew him. We went to school together. He was the most careful thinker I ever encountered in a room full of careful thinkers." He stood. "If he left you what you say he left you, he was still protecting you after he was gone." Serena said nothing. She picked up her bag and the laptop, and she kept her face composed, and she thanked him and walked toward the door. And Landon watched the back of her neck for the moment when the composure cost something, which came just before she reached the door. a slight tightening across her shoulders, there and gone. He followed her out. They had 5 hours to fill before the meeting. Patricia had arranged the use of a small office in a building 2 blocks from Blackwood Tower. The office of a former colleague of Serena's who was currently abroad, accessed with a key code that Patricia had sent by encrypted message. The office was sparse and functional, with a desk and 2 chairs and a window that looked out at the concrete side of the building next door. It was exactly what they needed. Serena spent an hour going through the trust documents one more time, marking the section she would cite, rehearsing the specific language the document required her to use when invoking the provisions. Landon sat across from her and read the documents too. She'd given him his own printed copy, and asked questions when the legal language bent into something opaque, and she explained it without condescension, which he appreciated. He called Mrs. Calloway at 9. She'd been with Emma since 6:30. Emma had read the note and had questions, Mrs. Calloway said, which she had answered with the 4-word summary that Landon was taking care of something and would be back for dinner. Emma had then asked for a second bowl of cereal and opened a book, which Mrs. Calloway reported in a tone of mingled exasperation and admiration. "She's all right," Landon told Serena when he hung up. "I know," she said, but she released a breath when he said it. Around 11:30, Patricia arrived. She was a small woman in her early 40s with dark hair and an expression of someone who had been operating under sustained pressure for weeks and was managing it entirely through professionalism. She shook Landon's hand first, which seemed to slightly surprise her once she'd done it, and then turned to Serena and looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite professional. "You look terrible," Patricia said. "Thank you," Serena said. "I mean, you look like you've been sleeping in strange places and eating whatever was available." "That's accurate." "But you're here." Patricia said it with a quality of relief she didn't bother to mask. "You're actually here." "I'm here," Serena said. "Tell me what's happening in there." Patricia had been inside the building that morning. She'd attended a preliminary meeting of the board's administrative staff, the kind of pre-meeting meeting that always happened before significant board sessions. And she'd noted everything with the careful peripheral attention of someone who had been performing this service for Serena without anyone knowing for 4 months. Fitch and Hale had arrived early, which was unusual. Roland Cross had been seen in the lobby at 10:30, speaking with the building's head of security, a conversation that made Patricia's stomach drop, because the building's head of security had been hired 2 years ago through a process that she now realized, in hindsight, had been influenced by Marcus Hale. She'd told Serena this through the encrypted app, and Serena had heard it, and now the 3 of them sat in the small borrowed office and factored it in. "He's trying to control the access points," Serena said. "If he's worked the security angle, he may be planning to flag me as a non-authorized entrant when I come in." "Can he do that?" Landon asked. "He can try, but my biometric access is hardwired into the system at a level that would require an IT administrator with executive authorization to override, and I'm the executive authorization." She paused. "The question is whether he's found a workaround." "What's the workaround?" Serena and Patricia exchanged a look. "If he has something, documentation of any kind, claiming that I've voluntarily resigned or that I've been declared legally incapacitated, he could use that to justify the security override." Serena was working through it as she spoke. "It would be fraudulent, but the security system doesn't adjudicate fraud. It just responds to documentation presented to it." "Does he have that kind of documentation?" "Not real documentation," she said, "but Cross has lawyers who can produce paper that looks real long enough to get past a security desk." She was very still. "If I'm stopped at the entrance and delayed while they run the meeting without me, the Voting Rights Trust can't activate. It requires my presence to trigger." The room was quiet for a moment. "There's a service entrance on the north side of the building," Patricia said carefully. "I have a key card for it. It's used by facilities and IT staff. The biometric readers there are part of the same system as the main entrance." Serena looked at her. "You'd have to come with me to use the card." "I know. That puts you in the middle of this." Patricia looked at her with the expression of a person who had already had this conversation with herself and come to a conclusion. "I've been in the middle of this for 4 months, she said. "I just wasn't in a room with you." Serena was quiet. There was something working in her face, something that had nothing to do with strategy. "Okay," she said. "North entrance. We go in at 1:50. She looked at Landon. "You should wait outside," she said. "There's a coffee place across the street, the one on the corner. If you don't hear from me by—" "I'm not waiting in a coffee place," he said. "Landon, I'll wait in the lobby." "The lobby might not be safe." "Then I'll deal with that." He said it with the particular calm of someone who has made the decision already and doesn't feel the need to argue it. "I'm not waiting across the street." She looked at him. He looked back. Patricia looked at her hands with the expression of someone who had correctly read the room and was staying out of it. "The lobby," Serena said finally. "The lobby," he confirmed. They arrived at Blackwood Tower at 1:45. The building was a glass and steel column in the financial district, 44 floors, the Blackwood name in silver letters above the main entrance. Landon had driven past buildings like it 1,000 times without really looking at them. He looked at this one. He went in through the main entrance and took a position near the elevator bank, behind a large structural column that gave him a sight line to both the main entrance and the elevator indicators. He was wearing the cleanest of the 2 shirts he'd brought, a dark blue button-down that was presentable without being conspicuous, and he had his phone in his hand and Kessler's direct number pulled up in his contacts. The lobby was active with the specific rhythm of a corporate building in the afternoon. People in good suits moving with purpose, a security desk manned by 2 guards, a reception area with a display of the company's history and achievements framed in brushed metal. He watched without appearing to watch, which was a skill he'd developed in his teens working in places where you needed to know who was near your work without making it obvious. He saw Cross before he recognized him. A man in his early 60s, silver-haired, built with the precise proportions of someone who had always had access to good nutrition and regular exercise, and used that access deliberately. His suit was charcoal, and his bearing was the relaxed bearing of a person who moved through spaces as though they'd been prepared for him. He came through the main entrance at 1:50 with 2 men who were dressed just well enough to look like lawyers and were built just wrong enough to be something else. He stopped at the security desk. One of the guards, the senior one, Landon thought, greeted him with the deference of someone who had been briefed. Cross spoke briefly. The guard nodded and picked up a phone. Landon texted Serena. "Cross is in the lobby. 3 men. Main entrance. Heads up." Her response came back in 40 seconds. "We're in. Service entrance. On our way up." He let out a breath he hadn't been holding consciously. Cross moved toward the elevators with his 2 associates. Landon turned slightly, keeping the column between them. One of the associates, the taller one, was scanning the lobby in the way that security personnel do, sweeping and returning, and Landon kept very still and looked at his phone and waited for the scan to pass. The elevators opened. Cross and his men went in. Landon waited 30 seconds and then moved to the elevator bank and pressed the button for the 42nd floor. He was 3 floors below the boardroom when his phone buzzed with a call from a number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go, and then something made him answer. "Mr. Pierce." The voice was smooth and unhurried. "Don't be alarmed. This is Roland Cross. I noticed you in the lobby." Landon stood in the elevator, watching the floor numbers rise. "We haven't met," Landon said. "No, but I know who you are. The mechanic from Glenbrook. You've been very kind to Ms. Blackwood this week." A pause. "I'm calling as a courtesy. This situation, what she's walked you into, is not something you have any stake in. You're a bystander, a genuinely good man who helped someone in trouble." "Okay," Landon said. "I'm suggesting that you leave the building. Take the elevator back down, walk out the front door, go home to your daughter. Whatever Ms. Blackwood has told you about this situation, whatever evidence she's shown you, she's a woman under extraordinary stress who has constructed a narrative that flatters herself and condemns the people trying to manage a legitimate business problem." The voice was patient and reasonable and very, very practiced. "You have nothing to gain by being here." The elevator stopped on 42. The doors opened. Landon stepped out. "That's a lot of words," he said, "for a man who's about to lose." He hung up. The boardroom was at the end of the hall. A set of double doors in dark wood closed. The hallway was empty except for one person, a woman standing at the far end with her back against the wall and her arms crossed, watching the boardroom doors with the expression of someone waiting for something they have no power to hurry. Donna Price. He recognized her from the photos Serena had shown him. Mid-50s, silver-streaked hair, the polished presentation of a person who had always operated at the highest levels and wore that history in her posture. She looked at him when he came off the elevator, and something shifted in her face, recognition, but confused recognition, the look of someone who knows they should know who you are and can't place you. "You're the man from the farm," she said. "Yes." She studied him. "She told you about me." "Some." Donna Price was quiet for a moment. Her arms uncrossed and her hands came together in front of her, and she looked at the boardroom doors with something that had none of the calculation and hard strategy he'd been expecting. She looked tired. She looked for a moment like a person who had made decisions they'd justified to themselves for months, and was standing in the last hour before those decisions became permanent, and something in the quality of that hour had changed the light on everything. "Is she here?" Donna Price asked. "Yes," he said. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, he thought she might say something, an explanation, or a defense, or a justification. She didn't. She just said, "I know." He didn't know what she meant by that. He thought there might be more than one meaning. The boardroom doors opened. Serena came through them. She was dressed in the same clothes she'd arrived in 3 days ago, cleaned as best she could manage, and she was walking with the bad leg slightly wrong, and she looked nothing like the woman on the magazine covers. And she looked entirely like herself, which was something different, something the covers had apparently never managed to capture. Patricia was a step behind her. The room beyond the doors was visible for a moment. A long table, faces turning, the particular stunned quality of people who have been expecting one thing and are receiving something else entirely. Fitch was on his feet. He looked at Serena the way you look at something that shouldn't exist. "You can't be in this meeting," he said. "The board voted to—" "The board hasn't voted anything yet," Serena said. She walked past him to the head of the table. She put the folder of documents on the table. "Gerald, sit down." He didn't sit down immediately. He looked at the men with him, Hale, who had gone gray in the face, 2 board members Landon couldn't identify, and Roland Cross, who had come through a different door at the back of the room and was standing very still near the far wall with his arms at his sides and his expression entirely composed. Cross and Serena looked at each other across the length of the boardroom. It was Cross who broke the look first. A small thing, almost invisible, but it happened. Landon stood in the doorway and watched Serena open the folder and take a breath and begin, and he thought about the drive in the dark and the kitchen table in the middle of the night, and a 7-year-old's matter-of-fact declaration that homes were where people stopped pretending, and he thought about a man who had written a note about someone who moved quietly and always toward the exit, and how that man's daughter had that note memorized in her bones. He thought about Claire. He thought, you would have liked her. He stayed in the doorway. He stayed. Donna Price did not go into the boardroom. She stayed in the hallway standing against the wall, and Landon stood at the doorway, and they waited in the kind of silence that contains everything that has already been decided and cannot now be undecided. Through the open door came Serena's voice, even and specific and carrying the weight of 4 months of careful accumulation. And then Cross's voice, still smooth, still controlled, asking procedural questions that were actually stall tactics. And then Patricia's voice reading from a legal document, and Fitch saying something sharp and defensive, and Hale saying nothing at all. At 1:58, Kessler's 2 agents came off the elevator. Donna Price looked at them and then looked at Landon. "I'm going to cooperate," she said. "I want you to know that. Whatever Serena, whatever she needs from me, I'll cooperate." Landon looked at her for a long moment. He thought about a woman who had been someone's Aunt Donna for 30 years, and had made the choices she'd made, and was now standing in a hallway with that history on her. "You should tell her that yourself," he said. Donna Price nodded once. She straightened slightly, the way a person does when they've decided to walk towards something hard rather than away from it. And then she walked into the boardroom. He stayed in the doorway. He stayed through all of it. The boardroom at Blackwood Technologies had floor-to-ceiling windows on the north and east walls, and on a clear afternoon the view stretched across the Chicago skyline in a way that the company's architects had clearly intended to be impressive. It was not a clear afternoon. The sky outside was the flat, heavy gray of late November pressing down on the city, and the light coming through the glass was the kind that made everything look slightly more serious than it already was, which, given the circumstances, was not nothing. Serena stood at the head of the table and let the room settle. There were 11 people seated at that table, not counting Cross, who had positioned himself near the back wall with the studied neutrality of a man who wanted to be seen as an observer while being the reason everyone was in the room. Patricia stood to Serena's right with a second copy of the trust document. Kessler's two agents, a man and a woman, both in dark suits, both with the specific quality of stillness that federal investigators develop, had taken positions near the door. Donna Price had come in and taken a chair at the far end of the table, away from Fitch and Hale, which was a statement without words. Gerald Fitch was still standing. He was a broad man in his mid-60s, the kind of man who had spent 40 years in boardrooms and believed that physical presence conveyed authority. He looked at Serena with an expression that was trying to be outrage and kept sliding towards something more complicated. "This meeting was called under emergency provisions," he said. "Your attendance is... There are procedural questions about whether you can simply walk in and..." "Sit down, Gerald," Serena said again. "I won't be..." "You'll sit down, or the agents near the door will have a reason to make that decision for you." She said it without raising her voice. "And I don't think you want that, because the moment this becomes a law enforcement action rather than a board proceeding, you lose the last 20 minutes of procedural control you have left." Fitch sat down. The room was very quiet. Marcus Hale had not moved since she walked in. He was a slight man, careful in his dress, the kind of person who had always operated through other people and behind documents, and had apparently decided that the best strategy available to him right now was perfect stillness. He was looking at the table surface with the expression of a man performing a complex interior calculation and not liking the results. Serena opened the folder. "I'm going to do something that's going to feel unfair to some of you," she said, addressing the full table. "I'm going to be brief, because I've been carrying this for 4 months, and I'm tired, and because the documentation speaks for itself, and because some of you in this room had nothing to do with what I'm about to describe and deserve to have your afternoon returned to you as quickly as possible." She looked at the board members who were not Fitch or Hale, 7 of them, various ages, various degrees of confusion and alarm visible on their faces. She had worked with most of these people. Some of them she trusted. Some of them she was less sure about, which was the uncomfortable reality of running a company where the rot had been growing quietly for over a year. 14 months ago, she said, Roland Cross began transferring money into accounts controlled by Gerald Fitch and Marcus Hale. The transfers were structured to avoid reporting thresholds. They were routed through a series of intermediary entities. I have the complete chain documented. And they were contingent on a specific outcome: my removal as CEO and Cross's conversion of his investment position to a controlling stake in this company. She put the first set of documents on the table and slid copies down the length of it. Those are the wire transfer records, the amounts, the dates, the account numbers, and the corresponding shell entities. My documentation connects each shell entity to either Fitch, Hale, or Cross through corporate registration records filed in 3 states and 2 offshore jurisdictions. She waited while the copies moved down the table. She watched faces change as people read. A woman at the far end of the table, Helen Cho, the board's longest-serving independent director, a person Serena had always respected and who had always been scrupulously careful about whose side she appeared to be on, looked up from the documents with an expression that was not the careful neutrality Serena was used to from her. It was something sharper, something that had already decided. "Go on," Helen said. Serena went on. She laid it out in sequence, the way she'd laid it out for Kessler that morning. The financial records, the email chains, the forged approval on a vendor contract that had redirected $11 million of company funds into a Fitch-controlled account under the guise of a consulting arrangement that had never actually produced any consulting. She walked through the timeline of Cross's approach to her refusal, and the subsequent 18-month plan to manufacture the conditions for her removal. She talked for 22 minutes. She kept her voice level. She was not performing anger, which she thought her father would have approved of. He'd always said that the most effective thing you could do in a room full of people trying to take something from you was to simply describe, clearly and without decoration, exactly what they were doing. It was harder for people to defend against precision than against emotion. When she stopped, she looked at Cross. He was still near the back wall. His expression had not changed materially since she'd begun. He was still doing the composed, faintly concerned face of a disinterested party who was hearing troubling things about people he'd worked with in good faith. It was a good performance. She'd expected a good performance. "Serena," he said, and his voice was exactly what it had been on the phone with Landon in the elevator. Smooth, reasonable, slightly regretful. "I understand that the past week has been traumatic for you. The accident, the stress of Roland." She looked at him directly. "The brake system on my vehicle was tampered with. Federal investigators are currently examining the vehicle, which was recovered from the ditch off Route 41 2 days ago. The tampering will be traceable. Everything is always traceable if you have the right people looking." She paused. "You of all people know that." His expression shifted, just slightly. Not fear, he was too controlled for visible fear. But something changed in the calculation behind his eyes, the way the light changes in a room when a door opens somewhere else in a building. A small thing, but it was there. Fitch's lawyer, a man named Barrett who had been sitting against the wall with a legal pad saying nothing, leaned forward and began to speak. Serena talked over him. "The Voting Rights Trust," she said, and put the final document on the table. Patricia read it. Patricia had a good voice for reading legal documents, clear, unhurried, precise, and she read the full relevant provisions while the room held very still. Serena watched the faces. She watched Gerald Fitch's jaw tighten and then loosen as he understood the implications. She watched Marcus Hale's hands, which were flat on the table, go flat in a different way, the flatness of someone pressing down to keep something from showing. She watched Helen Cho read the trust document with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what she was looking at. When Patricia finished, the silence was a specific kind, the kind that comes after a door closes that cannot be reopened. "You called this meeting," Serena said to Fitch, "which means the formal removal proceeding is underway, which means the trust provisions are active." She looked at Cross. "Whatever majority you've built on this board, whatever you were planning to do with the votes you've collected, you cannot complete a takeover of this company. Not today, not through this mechanism, not ever without my direct agreement and the dissolution of the trust by a court of law." She collected the documents on the table in front of her with the calm of a person completing a task they've been working toward for a long time. "Which you will not get." Barrett, the lawyer, was on his feet. He was talking about procedural challenges and forensic verification and the need for independent review of the documentation. His voice had the mechanical quality of a man executing a delay strategy that he knew was a delay strategy. Kessler's agents had moved away from the wall. Cross looked at Serena one more time. She looked back. "You should have taken the investment," he said quietly, just to her, not quite loud enough for the room. "My father warned me about you," she said, "specifically, by name." Something moved in Cross's face. For the first time, it was fully uncontrolled, a brief, involuntary thing that was half anger and half something older than anger. And then it was gone, and the composed face was back, but it was back a half second too late, and the people in that room who were paying attention had seen what was underneath. The female agent moved toward Cross. The male agent moved toward Fitch. Barrett stopped talking. The formal arrests happened in the lobby. That was Kessler's doing. He had determined that the lobby was the most controlled environment for the physical detentions, and so Cross and Fitch and Hale were walked out of the elevator and across the marble floor of the building that bore the name of a company they had tried to steal, and the arrest happened there, in front of a security desk and a display of the company's history and 3 people waiting for the elevator who took out their phones with the reflexive certainty of a generation that documented everything. By evening, it would be on every news station in the country. Serena stood in the boardroom after the agents had gone and watched the lobby through the window. She watched Cross being escorted through the glass lobby doors, and she wasn't sure what she felt. Not triumph, exactly, Not relief, exactly. Something quieter and more exhausted than either of those. Something that had no clean name. Helen Cho came to stand beside her. "Your father was the best business person I ever worked with," Helen said. "And I've worked with a lot of them." "I know," Serena said. "He would have handled this exactly the way you handled it." Serena was quiet for a moment. "He would have done it faster," she said. "He would have seen Fitch and Hale coming before they were a problem." "Maybe." Helen looked at the lobby below. "But you did it while someone was trying to kill you. That's a different kind of thing." Patricia appeared at Serena's elbow with a bottle of water, which she opened and handed over with the professional efficiency of someone who had been anticipating needs for years. Serena drank half of it without stopping and looked at Patricia. "I'm giving you a raise," she said. "You've said that twice in the last 2 years," Patricia said, "and then you forget." "I won't forget this time." "You will," Patricia said, not unkindly, "but I'll remind you." Serena managed something that was almost a laugh. And then she looked toward the boardroom door and past it to the hallway, and past the hallway to the elevator bank, and she thought about a man who had said, "I'm not waiting in a coffee place," with the absolute calm of someone for whom the decision had already been made before she'd finished the sentence. Landon was in the lobby. He'd come down when the agents brought the 3 men off the elevator, and he'd stood to the side and watched the arrest happen with the expression of a person observing something they'd expected and were still finding strange to see in real life. He was near the building's main entrance, his hands in the pockets of his dark blue shirt, when Serena came off the elevator. She walked across the lobby toward him, and he watched her come, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "It's done," she said. "I know, I saw." She looked at him. He was tired. She could see it now in the way she'd been too focused to see it upstairs. The specific exhaustion of someone who had been operating on coffee and 3 hours of sleep and sustained alertness for the better part of 24 hours. She thought she probably looked the same. "Your phone call with Cross," she said, "in the elevator. What did he say to you?" "He suggested I leave the building. Said you dragged me into something that wasn't my problem." Landon considered this briefly. "He was pretty convincing, actually. If I'd just met him on the street, I'd have probably thought he was reasonable." "He is reasonable," she said. "That's the thing about people like him. They're genuinely reasonable right up until they're not, and by the time you can see the line, you're already on the other side of it." He nodded slowly, the way he did when something confirmed something he'd already suspected. "What did you say to him?" she asked. "I told him he was about to lose and hung up." She looked at him for a moment. Outside the glass lobby doors, a news van had appeared at the edge of the block. Someone had gotten there fast, which meant the video from a bystander's phone had already moved. In another 20 minutes, this lobby would be difficult to stand in. "We should go," she said. "Yeah." They went through the side exit that Patricia had scoped out that morning, coming out onto a narrow service street that ran along the building's east face, empty and unobserved. The gray sky overhead had gone darker, the November afternoon collapsing toward evening at its typical pace. The air was cold and smelled like the city, exhaust and old concrete, and something faintly metallic that Landon had always associated with Chicago specifically, a smell that had no equivalent anywhere else. They walked half a block before either of them spoke. "Emma's going to want to know everything," he said. "She's going to have questions." "She always has questions." He said it with the particular tone of a man who found this simultaneously wearing and wonderful. "I'm going to tell her as much as I can, the version without the parts that would keep her up at night." Serena walked beside him, the bad leg managing the uneven pavement with the focused compensation of someone who had stopped thinking about the pain and was simply working around it. "How much does that leave?" "Enough for a pretty good story," he said. "Strong woman in trouble. Good people who helped. Bad people who got what they deserved." He glanced at her. "She'll like that version." "Will she like me?" Serena said it before she'd fully decided to, and heard it come out with a vulnerability she hadn't intended to expose, and did not take it back because taking it back would have been worse. Landon stopped walking. She stopped too. He looked at her with an expression she'd been learning to read over the past 3 days. The specific quality of his attention when he was being completely honest. "She already does," he said. "She decided the first night." Serena looked at the pavement. She breathed. I don't know what to do with that, she said. You don't have to do anything with it, he said. It's just true. They stood on the narrow service street in the growing dark for a moment, the sounds of the city moving around them. A siren somewhere, the bass rumble of the elevated train 2 blocks over, a phone ringing in a window above. All the ordinary sounds of a city going about its business after something extraordinary had happened inside one of its buildings. I called my attorney from the boardroom, she said, before we came down. She's already filed the documentation with the trust administrator. The board transition process will start tomorrow. Helen Cho will serve as acting chair until the independent review is complete. She paused. It'll be months before it's fully resolved. Federal investigations are slow. There will be depositions, document reviews, probably civil suits running alongside the criminal proceedings. Will you be okay through that? I'll be working 70 hours a week trying to stabilize the company while simultaneously cooperating with a federal investigation, she said. So no, probably not okay in any comfortable sense, but yes, I'll be okay. He accepted this distinction without requiring her to explain it. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes. The past 4 months, building the case, gathering the evidence, doing it alone while running the company, and not knowing who you could trust. He looked at her directly. Was there anyone? She understood what he was asking. Was there anyone who knew? Was there anyone she'd come home to, or called when it got to be too much, or sat across a table from in the small hours while the walls of her apartment pressed in and the weight of it all had nowhere to go? No, she said. There wasn't. He nodded. I'm sorry about that. It's the life I built, she said. Efficient, you said this morning. That's accurate. I said you said it was efficient. And I said it was accurate. He was quiet for a moment. Then, it doesn't have to stay that way. She looked at him. He looked back with the same directness he'd been looking at her since a rainy highway 3 nights ago. The same quality of attention that asked nothing and withheld nothing, and simply offered, cleanly, whatever it was. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know what she had the right to want or the courage to reach for, standing in a service alley in Chicago 2 hours after the most important professional moment of her life, exhausted and injured and not yet finished being afraid. But she didn't look away. Let's go home, she said. She meant it the way she said it, toward Glenbrook, toward the farmhouse, toward the note on the kitchen table, and the yellow star pajamas, and the crooked porch that sloped slightly left. She meant it the way Emma had said it, home because of who's in it. Not because it was hers, not yet, maybe not ever, in the conventional sense, but for tonight. Yeah, he said. Let's go. They stopped for food on the way out of the city, a diner off the highway, orange vinyl booths and a laminated menu and coffee that was weak in the way diner coffee often was, which after the past few days felt almost celebratory in its ordinariness. Serena ate scrambled eggs and toast and did not check her phone for 20 minutes, which she later thought might have been the most disciplined thing she'd done all week. Landon ate a burger with the single-minded satisfaction of someone who had not eaten a real meal since the previous night and was not pretending otherwise. They talked about small things, about the diner's jukebox, which was loaded with songs from 30 years ago and played one every few minutes without being asked, about a story he told her of a transmission he'd rebuilt 3 years ago on a 1972 Chevelle that turned out to belong to a retired circus performer, which she found inexplicably funny, about a conference she'd attended in Tokyo 2 years ago where the translator had rendered one of her remarks as something apparently very different from what she'd said, based on the room's reaction, and she'd never found out what. The ordinary human texture of it, the way conversations move when the pressure lifts, not toward anything important, just through the territory of being people together, which has its own value and asks nothing in return. What happens to the farmhouse? She asked, somewhere around the 3rd cup of coffee. What do you mean? When this is fully resolved and I'm back in Chicago full time, what happens to your life? He thought about it honestly. Same as before, mostly. Emma goes to school, I go to work. Mrs. Calloway comes when I need her. We eat dinner and do homework and argue about bedtime. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. It's a good life. It's not exciting, but it's good. You don't find it? She stopped. Small, he said. Not to me. She looked at him. I wasn't going to say small. People usually mean small. I was going to say, I don't know, lonely, maybe. She said it carefully, knowing it was not a neutral word. He considered it. Sometimes, he said. Yeah, sometimes it's lonely. He put the coffee cup down. You? Always, she said without hesitation, and was surprised by her own honesty. Even in rooms full of people, even in meetings where I'm the one doing all the talking. She turned her own cup. Especially then, actually. That's something my father used to say, he said. That the loneliest he ever felt was the year his company put him in a bigger office. More room, fewer people who said real things to him. She thought about her apartment. The word efficient. Your father sounds like he figured some things out, she said. He figured out the important ones, Landon said. Eventually. The jukebox played something slow and instrumental, some song without a name she could recognize, and the diner was warm, and outside the window the highway was a ribbon of lights heading west through the flat Illinois dark, and she sat with the strange specific peace of a moment that had no precedent in her recent life and made no demands on her for the next 5 minutes. She wanted to hold it. She tried not to hold it too tight, because she understood, somewhere in the exhausted and still wary part of her brain, that moments like this were not improved by being gripped. Emma was awake. She was sitting on the porch steps in her coat over the yellow star pajamas that were definitively too small and that she was clearly going to have to be talked into retiring, with a book open on her knees and the porch light on above her, and when the car came up the gravel drive, she looked up with the expression of someone who had been pretending to read for the better part of an hour. Mrs. Calloway appeared in the doorway behind her with her coat and her purse, and the expression of a woman who had decided not to ask any questions tonight and had no guarantee she'd be able to maintain that decision past the threshold. Landon got out of the car, and Emma closed her book and came down the porch steps. She looked at her father with the careful eyes that were her mother's eyes. You're back, she said. I said I would be. She looked past him at Serena, who had gotten out of the passenger side and was standing in the light from the porch, the bad leg angled slightly, her bag over one shoulder. Emma studied her with the particular thoroughness of a child who has decided something matters. Did it work? Emma asked. Not to her father, to Serena. Serena looked at her for a moment. Yeah, she said. It worked. Emma nodded once, the complete nod of someone whose confidence in a satisfactory outcome has been confirmed. Then she turned and went up the porch steps and held the door open, waiting with the natural authority of someone who lived in this house and was extending its hospitality. There's soup, she said. Mrs. Calloway made it. She said she wasn't going to, but she did. Mrs. Calloway, in the doorway, looked at the sky. Serena walked up the porch steps. She passed Emma in the doorway, and Emma let the door swing slightly so that they were both holding it for a moment. A small, accidental thing, shoulders almost touching. Emma, Serena said. Emma looked up at her. Thank you, Serena said, for keeping my secret. Emma considered this with great seriousness. You kept ours too, she said. So we're equal. Serena looked at this small person in the too small pajamas and the coat and the certainty, and something that had been held very tightly for a very long time released its grip slightly. Not all the way. It would take longer than a single evening to fully open what had been closed for years, but slightly. She went inside. The house was warm and smelled like soup, and the note was still on the kitchen table where Landon had left it that morning, the 4 sentences in the big letters. She picked it up without thinking and read it again. I'll be home before dinner. I love you more than everything. And set it back down. The soup was good. Outside, the old oak stood in the dark along the gravel drive, and the loose board in the barn was quiet for once, and the porch light stayed on. The soup was lentil and vegetable, and it was better than anything any of them had eaten in days, and they sat around the kitchen table and ate it without much conversation, which was the right call. Some meals are not about talking. Some meals are about the simple physical fact of being in a warm room with food in front of you and the worst part behind you, and the body knows that even when the mind is still running, still processing, still cataloging everything that almost went wrong. Emma ate 2 bowls and fell asleep on the couch before 8 o'clock, which she would have been embarrassed about if she'd been awake to know it. Landon carried her upstairs without waking her and came back down to find Serena standing at the kitchen sink with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, looking out the window at the dark fields. She stayed 3 more days. She told him it would be 1, maybe 2. Her attorney needed signatures. Kessler's office needed a formal deposition. The company needed her visible and present and functional in ways that had nothing to do with a farmhouse in Glenbrook, Illinois. All of that was true. And still she stayed 3 more days, and neither of them made a particular point of it. The deposition happened by video, at the kitchen table with the laptop open, and Kessler on the screen and a court reporter somewhere in a Chicago office building transcribing every word. It took 4 hours. Landon stayed out of the room. He went to the shop for the first time in a week and told Gil what he could tell him, which was not everything. And Gil listened and said, "Sounds like you had a week," and handed him a work order for a seized alternator. He fixed the alternator and came home, and Serena was still at the kitchen table, the laptop closed now, her hands flat on the surface in the quiet aftermath of a very long session of being precise about things she would have preferred to say only once. "You all right?" he asked from the doorway. "No," she said. Then, "Yes, I will be." Emma came home from school an hour later and conducted her own decompression process, which involved sitting very close to Serena on the couch and reading aloud from the chapter book about the girl who talked to animals. Not because she needed to be read to, but because she understood, in her 7-year-old way, that sometimes a person needs to sit beside someone and be absorbed in something that has nothing to do with the real world. Serena listened with her eyes half closed and her tea cooling on the end table and did not fall asleep, though it was close. Landon watched from the kitchen doorway and thought about something his wife had told him once. When Emma was barely 2 and prone to climbing onto people with the unselfconscious physicality of a small child who has not yet learned that bodies are private things. She knows who she trusts by how close she gets. She's never wrong about it. He thought about that for a while. On the second night, after Emma was in bed, he and Serena sat on the porch in the cold. The temperature had dropped into the 30s, and they were both in their coats, and he'd brought out 2 mugs of coffee that got cold faster than they could drink them. And the sky was clear for the first time all week. A hard, deep winter clear, the kind that only happens when the temperature drops enough to pull all the moisture out of the air. Stars from one end of it to the other. "Patricia called this afternoon," Serena said. "Helen Cho has the board operating in a functional way. The share price stabilized after the initial drop. Media coverage is about what you'd expect." She paused. "It's going to be fine." "You don't sound like it's going to be fine." "It is going to be fine in all the external ways." She turned the cold mug in her hands. "I just keep thinking about Donna Price." He'd wondered when they'd get to Donna Price. At the meeting, after the arrests, Donna had stayed in the boardroom and had a 40-minute conversation with Kessler's agents that Serena had not been present for. She'd heard the outline of it from Kessler later. Donna had provided substantial corroborating information about Fitch and Hale's arrangements with Cross, information she'd been holding and apparently had been uncertain what to do with for months. Her cooperation had been complete and immediate. Her attorney had subsequently reached out to the federal prosecutor's office to discuss terms. "She knew," Serena said. "She'd known for at least 8 months, maybe more." "Why didn't she come to you?" Serena was quiet for a long moment. "I've been trying to figure that out. The obvious answer is that she was protecting herself. She'd been close enough to it that she was implicated, and coming to me would have meant confessing her own exposure." She shifted in the porch chair. "But I don't think that's all of it. I think she also didn't come to me because she was ashamed. Because she'd known my father for 18 years and she'd let his daughter walk into a trap that she could see being built." Another pause. "And I think she found that very hard to look at directly. She helped at the end," he said. "She did. Does that count for something?" Serena thought about this honestly. He could see her actually weighing it rather than reaching for the easy answer in either direction. "I think it counts for something," she said finally. "I don't know yet how much. I'm not there yet, where I can put a number on it." She looked at the sky. "My father would have forgiven her completely, because he understood people in a way I'm still learning. He always said that the worst thing a person could do wasn't the betrayal. It was the failing to correct it once they knew, the holding the knowledge and doing nothing. She paused. She didn't do nothing in the end. Eventually, he said. Eventually, she agreed, which is better than never. They sat with that for a while. The cold settled around them in the particular way of late autumn nights in the Midwest. Not aggressive, just absolute, the world making itself clear. Can I tell you something? She said. Yeah. I built Blackwood Technologies, my version of it, the 2 years I've actually been in charge. I built it the way I thought my father would have wanted. Every decision I made, I ran it through this internal filter. What would he think of this? Is this what he meant for it to be? She stopped. And I've been sitting with the fact that he knew 6 months before he died that people close to him were going to try to take it from his daughter. He built a wall around the trust. He wrote a note about Roland Cross and filed it where I'd eventually find it. He was protecting me from people he'd spent years working alongside. She shook her head slightly. He never told me any of it, not directly. I don't know if he was protecting me from worry, or if he thought I wasn't ready to hear it, or if he just ran out of time. Maybe all three, Landon said. Maybe all three, she said. And I keep being angry at him for not telling me, and then I keep coming back to the fact that he did everything he could with the time he had. And the anger is, it's not about him really. It's about the fact that I wish I'd had more time with him. Just more ordinary time. Not crisis preparation, just him. She said the last sentence quietly, and it had the sound of something she hadn't said out loud before, and he didn't try to improve on it. Yeah, he said, I know that particular wish. She looked at him. Claire. Claire, he said. They sat in the cold for a long time after that, not talking, which was its own kind of conversation. Somewhere in the dark barn, the loose board was quiet. One of the old oaks along the drive creaked in a small wind that touched nothing else, and then was gone. The sky turned overhead with its usual indifference to everything happening beneath it, which was actually, when you sat with it long enough, more comforting than it sounds. Mom. On the third day, the morning before she left, Emma asked if she could show Serena something. She led her out through the back door and across the yard, through the gate in the fence that opened onto the back field, dormant now, the soil dark and bare, the remnant of someone else's farm work from long before Landon bought the place. At the far edge of the field, where the fence met a stand of old oak trees, there was a flat stone that Landon had moved there 3 years ago, and in the summer there were usually wildflowers around it that Emma tended with the serious attentiveness of someone maintaining something important. There were no wildflowers now. It was November. But Emma stood beside the stone with her hands in her coat pockets and looked at it with the particular expression she sometimes wore when she was trying to say something and was figuring out how. This is where I come when I miss her, she said. My mom. Serena stood beside her. The morning air was cold and completely still. She's not here or anything, Emma said, with the practical accuracy of a child who had been given honest answers about death and had processed them in her own way. It's just a place, but it's a good place to think about her. She looked at the stone. I told her about you. Serena looked at the side of Emma's face. What did you tell her? She said. Emma thought about it. I said there was a woman who came and she was sad even when she didn't look sad, and that she listened really well, and that she made Dad seem less... Emma paused, choosing her word with the carefulness of someone who understood its weight. Less quiet. The field was silent around them. A bird somewhere in the oaks, one note, and then nothing. That's a very honest thing to say, Serena said. Mom liked honest things. Emma glanced up at her. Dad says that's where I get it. Serena stood with this for a moment. She thought about a man who drove a highway he'd driven 100 times in the rain and stopped because the practical thing and the right thing happened to be the same thing that night. She thought about a note on a kitchen table in letters big enough to see from across the room. She thought about less quiet and what it meant for a 7-year-old to have noticed that, and what it cost a 7-year-old to say it out loud to a near stranger beside a stone in a bare November field. Emma, she said. Emma looked up. Your mom would be very proud of you. She said it not as a comfort and not as a platitude. She said it as a statement of observable fact, the same way she'd tell you the sky was gray or the drive was gravel. She would be genuinely proud of the kind of person you already are. Emma looked at her for a moment. Her eyes did the thing they did, that slight quality that was all her mother, that Landon saw and never knew what to do with. Then she nodded once, with the complete nod of someone receiving information that confirmed something they already suspected but needed to hear. She reached over and took Serena's hand. Not dramatically, not with any particular fanfare, just the simple, direct gesture of a child who had decided and was not uncertain about the decision. Her hand was small and cold through the coat sleeve. They stood there for a while. After a while, Emma said, "You're going to come back, right?" Serena looked at the stone, at the field, at the bare oaks against the winter sky. "Yes," she said. She meant it. But Landon drove her to the truck stop in Rockford where his truck had been waiting since the morning they'd left for Chicago. She transferred her bag to the passenger seat, which was something she'd done in reverse 4 days earlier, and the familiarity of the gesture had a quality to it that neither of them acknowledged directly. "Patricia will have someone pick up Ben's car," she said. "I'll let him know." "Good." She stood beside the car with her bag over her shoulder and her coat against the cold, and the truck stop around them was doing its usual business. Trucks idling, someone's radio audible from across the lot, the smell of diesel and coffee from the attached diner. The unglamorous setting for a departure that had things in it that were not unglamorous. "I want to tell you something," she said. He waited. "The night on the highway, when you stopped. I've thought about that a lot in the past week. The odds of it. You on that road, that night, going that direction, with enough decency, I guess, to get out of the truck in the rain and check." She shook her head slightly. "I'm not a person who puts much stock in things happening for a reason. I think mostly things just happen, and people make choices about what to do with them. But I think about you stopping, and I can't quite make it feel random." "It feels random from my side," he said. "Does it?" He thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "Not entirely." She looked at him with the same directness she'd been looking at him with since a ditch on Route 41. That quality of complete attention that she gave to everything she actually cared about, stripped of the professional veneer, just the real thing. "I don't know what this is," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I'm in the middle of a federal investigation, and a company restructuring, and a year of depositions, and I'm not someone who has ever been good at the personal parts of life. I've always been better at work than at being a person." "You're pretty good at being a person," he said. "I'm not, actually. Ask anyone who's worked for me." "I'm not asking anyone who's worked for you." She looked at him. Something was working in her face, a real thing, unmanaged. "I don't want to make you a promise I can't keep," she said. "I've watched people do that, make promises from the emotional height of a moment, and then find out that real life is longer and harder than the moment was tall." She paused. "So I'm not going to promise you anything specific, but I'm going to tell you that I meant what I said in that alley, and what I said to Emma this morning." She looked at him steadily. "I'm coming back." He nodded. He didn't say you don't have to because she knew she didn't have to, and she wasn't saying it as an obligation. He didn't say I'll be here because it was obvious and because some things are diminished by being said. He said, "Drive safe." She looked at him for one more moment, and then she got in the car. He watched the gray Ford pull out of the truck stop and onto the highway heading east toward Chicago, and he stood there until it was out of sight, and then he got in his truck and drove home. The months that followed were not simple. He hadn't expected them to be, and the fact that he hadn't expected it made them easier to move through than they might have been for someone who'd imagined that a thing resolved at a boardroom table was a thing simply put behind you. The federal investigation into Gerald Fitch, Marcus Hale, Roland Cross, and their various associates generated news coverage for weeks, and the coverage had the quality of all coverage involving money and betrayal. It was loud and then it faded, replaced by the next thing, and the actual legal proceedings moved at the pace that legal proceedings move, which is slow and methodical and entirely indifferent to the drama of the original events. Fitch and Hale entered guilty pleas in February. Cross fought his charges through a team of very expensive attorneys. which was what everyone who knew him had expected, and the case was still working through the federal court system many months later. Donna Price cooperated fully and received a negotiated outcome that kept her out of prison in exchange for testimony, and Serena was asked in a dozen interviews how she felt about that, and she gave the same answer each time, that she'd leave judgment to the courts and focus on the company. It was not the whole answer, but it was the honest part of it. Blackwood Technology spent 3 months under the oversight of an independent review committee before Helen Cho formally transitioned the chair role back to Serena in a process that was, as these things go, remarkably undramatic. The company reorganized. Patricia's raise happened, and this time Serena did not forget. 3 new board members were appointed from outside the company's existing network. People vetted with a rigor that Serena personally supervised and that Helen described with something like admiration as forensic. Patricia told Serena once, midway through a 16-hour day in January, that she'd noticed Serena seem different. Not softer exactly, she said, just less like she was carrying the company by herself. Serena had looked up from the document she was reviewing and said, "I learned something about what it costs to try to do everything alone." "What did it cost you?" Patricia asked. 4 months of my life, she said, and almost a lot more than that. She didn't say what else it had cost. Some things were not office conversation, but Patricia was not unintelligent, and she'd seen the way Serena checked her personal phone sometimes with an expression that had nothing to do with work, and she'd noticed that Serena had cleared her schedule on certain weekends with an unusual firmness about it. She didn't ask, because she understood the difference between things Serena shared and things that were hers to keep. She came back to Glenbrook in December the first time. She called ahead, which she hadn't done in the early planning stages of coming back, and then had decided was the right thing, not to ask permission, but to give notice, because arriving without notice felt like she was testing something, and she was done testing things for the year. She called on a Thursday, and Landon answered on the second ring and said, "Yeah, come," with the same easy directness he applied to everything, and she drove out on Saturday morning in her own car, a different car from the one that had gone into the ditch. And she took Route 41 west from the highway, and she looked at the spot where it had happened, the shoulder, the guardrail, the ditch with its dead November grass, and she drove past it without stopping. Some things you acknowledge and keep moving. Emma met her at the end of the drive. She was wearing a different pair of pajamas, purple with small silver moons, sized correctly, the yellow star pajamas apparently having finally been retired, under her coat, which suggested she'd gotten up and come outside before fully dressing, which Landon confirmed with the expression of a man who had given up on the relevant conversation. "You look different," Emma said, examining Serena with the close attention she applied to important things. "Different how?" Emma considered. "Less like you're in a hurry." Serena looked at her. She thought about the girl who'd said, "Homes are where people stop pretending," and about the field behind the house, and about a small cold hand taking hers without ceremony. "I'm not in a hurry today," she said. "Good," Emma said, as if this was a decision she'd been waiting for Serena to make, and was pleased to hear had finally been made. She took Serena's hand and pulled her up the drive toward the house. "Dad made a thing. He's been working on it for 2 days and he says it's fine, but I could tell he was nervous about it." Landon, visible in the kitchen through the window, was doing something at the stove with the focused deliberateness of someone who absolutely had not heard that. It was beef stew, it turned out, from a recipe his mother had given him that he'd made exactly twice before and felt uncertain about both times. It was good, genuinely, uncomplicatedly good. And they ate it at the kitchen table with the particular ease of people who had eaten at this table under much worse circumstances, and knew its dimensions, knew each other's patterns around it, knew how the afternoon light fell through the window, and where the loose board in the floor was that you learned to step around. After dinner, Emma cleared her own dishes and announced she was going to read and disappeared upstairs with the practiced timing of a child who understood when adults needed the room. Landon and Serena sat with their coffee in the kitchen's quiet. "How are you actually doing?" he asked. "Actually?" She thought about it. "Better than I was. Not as good as I want to be. Somewhere in the reasonable middle." She turned her cup. "The investigation is exhausting in the way that only legal processes can be, where the thing is resolved, but the paperwork of it being resolved goes on forever. But the company is good. The company is genuinely good. Maybe better than it's been in 2 years because the rot is out and the people left are people who chose to stay. And personally, she looked at him. I bought a house. He raised his eyebrows. Not in the city, about 40 minutes from here. It was a farmhouse, older than this one, but same general, similar bones. I bought it 3 weeks ago. She said it with the slightly defiant quality of a person who has made a decision they're not entirely sure how the other person will receive. I told myself it was an investment. That's the official explanation. What's the unofficial one? She looked at her coffee. That I drove past it on my way back from visiting the first time, and the drive was lined with old oak trees, and I pulled over and sat in the car and thought, I want to be close to something that feels like it matters. She paused. That's a completely irrational basis for purchasing a property worth... It sounds pretty rational to me, he said. She looked up. He was looking at her with the expression she'd learned to read over the course of a very compressed and very real set of days. The expression that asked nothing and withheld nothing and had no hidden calculation behind it. She had come to understand, over these months, that this was not a simple thing to find in a person. That she had been confusing the performance of openness with the real article for most of her adult life, and that the difference between them was something you could only really understand by standing in the presence of someone who had the real thing. I don't know how to do this, she said. I want to say that clearly. I know how to run a company and how to read a financial instrument and how to sit in a room where someone is trying to take something from me and not show them how scared I am. I don't know how to... She gestured at the space between them, which was not very wide. This. Neither do I, really, he said. I've been doing it wrong a few times before I did it right, and then the right one was gone, and now I'm... He stopped. Now I'm here, in this kitchen, with you sitting across the table, which is... He looked at her with an honesty that had no performance in it whatsoever. It's the best part of my week, Serena. Every time. It's the best part. She looked at him for a long moment. It's mine too, she said. It was not a declaration exactly. It was smaller than that and more durable, the way the things that last are usually small and specific rather than large and general. It was two people at a kitchen table in a farmhouse in Illinois in December, telling each other the true thing in the quiet way that true things are often told, not announced, just said, into the space between two people where it could be heard. The farmhouse she'd bought needed work, not the catastrophic kind, but the bones were sound, the roof was recent, the foundation was solid, but the accumulated neglect kind, paint peeling on the south-facing side, a porch that needed new boards, a kitchen that hadn't been updated since 1987 and had the particular grimness of a room that had been functional without being cared for. She hired a contractor. The contractor gave her a timeline. She called Landon and described the timeline, and he told her, with the calm authority of a man who had been working with his hands his whole life, that the timeline was optimistic and to add 6 weeks and she'd be closer. He was right. She drove out on weekends when she could and stood in rooms with drop cloths on the floors and breathed in the smell of sawdust and primer and thought about what it meant to restore something that had been left too long. There was a lesson in it that she didn't belabor but didn't ignore either. That neglect was not the same as ruin, that things could be reclaimed, that the process of making something habitable again required mostly patience and consistent attention, which were not glamorous qualities, but were the ones that mattered in the long term. Emma came with Landon on a Saturday in March to see the progress, and she walked through every room with the serious survey of a person conducting an inspection, and she stopped in what would be the main bedroom and stood at the window that looked out over the backfield and the bare trees at its edge. "This is a good window," she said. "I thought so too," Serena said. Emma turned around. "Are you going to live here?" "Yes," Serena said, "some of the time. I'll still need to be in Chicago during the week for work, but yes." Emma nodded. She was processing something, working through it with the methodical care she applied to things that mattered. "That means you'd be close," she said. 40 minutes. Emma looked at the window again. "That's not very far." "No," Serena said. "It's not." What Emma didn't say, but what she communicated with complete clarity in the way that children sometimes communicate the most important things, not through words but through the quality of the silence they hold after them, was that she was glad. That she had been glad since a November night when her father had come home with mud on his boots and a stranger with blood at her temple, and that the gladness had not required anything extraordinary to become something settled and permanent. It had just needed time and honesty, and enough people choosing to stay in rooms rather than leave them. That was all it had ever needed. They were married on a Saturday in early June, 14 months after a rainy night on Route 41. The ceremony was at a lake property belonging to a friend of Landon's, a small lake about 20 miles outside Glenbrook, ringed with old maples that were in full early summer leaf, the water the greenish blue of lakes in that part of Illinois when the weather has been kind. There were 43 people, which was not a small number but felt small because everyone there was genuinely someone. Patricia was there. Helen Cho was there. Gil from the shop, with his wife, who turned out to be a remarkably funny person whom Landon had somehow never mentioned in 2 years of friendship. Mrs. Calloway was there in a dress that suggested she had opinions about occasions and had dressed accordingly. Kessler came. He had not been expected to come, and he showed up anyway and stood in the back and shook Landon's hand and told him quietly that he'd done a remarkable thing, not the driving to Chicago, but the stopping on the road. That's where it started, Kessler said. Everything else followed from that. Landon thought about this later and decided it was true in the way that the most important things often turn out to be simple, that a single choice, made without full information in the middle of a rainy night, had redirected everything, that he hadn't known what he was stopping for, that he'd stopped anyway. He had thought about that a lot over the past year, about the mechanics of it, how the important choices rarely announce themselves as important at the time, how they look in the moment, like small practical decisions, pull over or don't pull over, get involved or don't, open a door or keep it shut. And then time passes and you look back and see that there was a hinge there, a pivot point, and on one side of it was the life you were living, and on the other side was the life you were going to live, and the only difference was a decision made in the dark on a wet road. He didn't think he was a special person for having made the decision. He thought he was a person who had been raised by people who understood that the right thing and the easy thing were not always the same, and that when they diverged, you picked the right thing and dealt with the consequences. It was not heroic. It was just how he'd been made. Emma stood up at the ceremony and said 3 sentences that she had written herself and refused to let anyone read in advance, which had made him more nervous than anything else about the day. She said, "My dad always told me that love is not the big moments. It's the person who shows up for the small ones. Serena shows up." That was all. 3 sentences. Half the people at the ceremony were crying before she finished the second one. Serena, standing beside Landon, did not cry during the ceremony because she had decided not to, and she was, when she committed to something, genuinely committed. But her hand tightened on his, and he felt it, and he looked at her, and she was looking at Emma with an expression that had no management in it at all, pure and undefended, the face of a person who has found the thing they didn't know they were missing and is still slightly amazed by it. He thought, Claire would have loved this. She would have loved her. He thought it without the usual ache, not because the ache was gone, it wasn't entirely, and probably never would be fully, but it had found its right place, the place where loss lives when you've stopped fighting it and started carrying it instead. Not in front of everything, just present, like a background note in music that deepens what you're hearing without overpowering it. Love is not a replacement for love. That was something he'd had to learn by living it, not by being told it. You don't build a new life by demolishing the old one. You build it on the same ground, with the same materials, the same hands, and the grief that was in those hands becomes part of what holds the new thing together. He had not expected that. He thought it was probably the most important thing he'd learned in 40 years of living. The reception was outside near the lake, under string lights that someone had strung between the maples in a way that made the evening feel like it was being held carefully in good hands. Emma danced with everyone willing to dance with her, which was most people, and she danced with particular determination with Mrs. Calloway, who turned out to have genuine ability that she had been concealing for reasons best known to herself. Patricia gave a toast that was 3 minutes long and had exactly the right number of jokes. Gil's wife, unprompted, told a story about Landon from 8 years ago that made everyone laugh and made Landon cover his face with his hand. At some point in the late evening, Serena found herself standing at the lake's edge with her shoes off, the grass cool under her feet, the water dark and still and reflecting the string lights from the maples in long, wavering lines. The noise of the party was behind her, present but softened by distance. Somewhere in it was Landon's voice and Emma's laugh, and the sound of people who had chosen to be in a room together because they wanted to be, which was the only reason that ever actually held. She stood there for a few minutes alone. She thought about a hospital room she'd never been in, where a woman named Claire had looked at the people who loved her and found some way to trust the future she wouldn't be in. She thought about a father who had written a note about a man who moved toward exits and filed it somewhere his daughter would eventually find it. She thought about the kind of care that operates at a distance, preparing things for people who don't know yet what they'll need. She thought about all the people who had pointed her, one way or another, toward a rainy highway in November, and how none of them had planned it, and all of them had contributed to it, and how the life was not the plan but the accumulation of small, honest choices made by imperfect people in the dark. She thought, you carry the people you've lost inside the living you do, and if you're lucky, the living you do is worthy of them. She thought that was probably the truest thing she knew. Landon appeared beside her. He'd taken his jacket off somewhere, his sleeves rolled up in the way she'd come to understand was his natural state. The version of him that wasn't performing anything, just existing. Emma's trying to teach Mrs. Calloway a dance she invented, he said. I give it 3 minutes before one of them injures something. Which one? Honestly, 50-50. She smiled. He stood beside her at the lake's edge, close enough that their shoulders touched, and they looked at the water and the lights reflected in it, and the dark maples and the sky above them settling into its full June dark. I want to tell you something, she said. Yeah. I spent a long time building a life that was very successful and very controlled and very sealed off, and I thought that was what strong looked like. That needing things was a vulnerability, and that the goal was to need as few things as possible. She looked at the water. I was wrong about that. Completely wrong. The sealed-off life isn't strong. It's just safe. And safe and strong are not the same thing. What changed your mind? He asked. She turned and looked at him directly. A mechanic who got out of his truck in the rain, she said. He looked back at her. In his eyes, she could see everything she'd come to know was there. The steadiness, the honesty, the specific quality of attention that had never once asked her to be different from what she was. We're going to be okay, he said. Not a promise about the future exactly, more of an assessment, the way he assessed engines, not with optimism or pessimism, but with the clear eyes of someone who understood the working parts and trusted what he saw. Yeah, she said. We are. Behind them, from the maples, Emma's laugh rang out, clear and sudden and completely unself-conscious, the laugh of a child who is fully inside the present moment, who has learned from the people around her that the present moment is worth being fully inside. It hung in the warm June air for a second, over the water, over the lights, over the two of them standing at the edge of the lake in the good dark. Serena closed her eyes and heard it. She let herself have it, the laugh, the lights, the shoulder against hers, the smell of the lake, and the maples, and the summer night. Without pulling back, without cataloging it, without building the distance that had been her armor for so long. She just let it be what it was, which was everything, which was enough.